Welcome back to Savannah Car and Truck Accident Law with Andy Conn. I'm Brooke, sitting down with Andy Conn of Conn Law Firm in Savannah, Georgia. Hey, Andy.
Hey, Brooke, how are you?
I'm great. Excited to be back with you today. Today is episode number 5, and we are answering one question every commercial truck crash victim in coastal Georgia asks. Why is a truck case worth so much more than a car case? And why is it so much harder to win? We are walking through why these cases run on a different legal track. The federal regulation only trucking companies follow, the evidence that disappears in days if no one preserves it, the multi-part liability stack that goes well beyond the driver, how Georgia's damages math actually works under O.C.G.A. and 5-1-12-33 are catastrophic, and what makes Savannah cases different given the Port of Savannah drayage layer and the I-95, I-16 corridor running through Chatham County. Truck cases look like car accident cases on the surface. They are not the same case. Before the evidence and the damages math, the legal framework itself is different. And in Georgia, that difference is sharper than in most states. A victim is comparing notes with a friend whose car accident case settled in 3 months and cannot understand why theirs is being treated differently. Why is the Savannah truck accident case treated so differently from a regular car accident case here in Georgia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first and most obvious is when you get hit by something that weighs as much as a heavy truck. Typically, that just means that you're going to be more injured. There's a higher likelihood of serious injuries and deaths in tractor trailer cases as opposed to if a Mazda 3 hits you, just because that's how physics work and that's how forces work. But one of the other reasons is less obvious, and that's that the truck drivers are held to a much higher standard than the average driver on the road. There's safety regulations, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations that they are required to abide by, but they very seldomly actually abide by all of those regulations. And so while if the injuries are even the same, a truck case might be worth more than the car wreck case because the truck wreck case might have an element of punitive damages because they might not have followed those safety regulations. And then the third reason is just because, frankly, commercial motor vehicles and heavy trucks have requirements on how much insurance they are required to carry. In Georgia, as a normal driver, you're only required to carry $25,000 in insurance coverage, whereas depending on the type of truck and whether it's interstate or intrastate, usually they have to maintain at least $750,000. Okay. So there's a lot of factors that can go into that. Why your friend's case might be worth more than yours because they got hit by a heavier truck. But those are the 3 main reasons.
Yeah, I was super curious about the insurance piece and imagined that it was quite different. And so you really went into that there. So A victim assumed the case was against the driver and is now learning 4 other defendants matter just as much. Who can actually be held responsible after a commercial truck wreck in Savannah?
Yeah, so obviously the truck driver who actually hit you can be held responsible. The company that they're either an employee of, or maybe they're not an employee, but they are a statutory employee, as we call them, which means they're driving on behalf of a company, they can be held responsible. In some circumstances, you used to be able to hold the insurance company in Georgia directly liable. These days, that they've changed the laws to where in some circumstances you can still directly hold the insurance carrier liable. And then the fourth, probably the least obvious thing, are brokers. So the companies, actually the United States Supreme Court just came out with a decision that said that you can recover against a broker who basically would be the company that would, place the driver with a particular company, and that they have standards that apply to them as well, that if they don't, act prudently, you can hold them responsible for putting a dangerous driver on the road.
That's super interesting. So, a victim is being told their case is catastrophic and is trying to understand why that label changes everything. What makes truck accident injuries typically more severe than car accident injuries? And where do Savannah victims go for trauma care?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, it's the forces of these massive trucks, are going to be the predominant reason why more often than not, unfortunately, we have catastrophic injuries and deaths. And, I-16 going from Savannah to Macon in Georgia is one of the most dangerous roads in America, certainly the most dangerous here in Georgia. And that's because the Port of Savannah, which we're very proud of, is the largest port on the eastern coast. And so that means there's a lot of trucks taking those containers from point A to point B. And so we have a lot of heavy trucks. But in Savannah, we have Memorial Hospital, which I believe is a Trauma 1 center. So they can handle the significant majority of catastrophic injury type cases. At times, they will have to be life flighted to either Atlanta or nearby Jacksonville. There's some bigger hospitals there, but typically Memorial Hospital is one that can handle most of the really bad injury cases for truck wrecks here in Savannah.
Interesting. I had no idea that the port was one of the largest on the East Coast. So the more you know.
Yeah.
A victim is learning the at-fault driver's coverage is not a small Georgia personal auto policy. How do the insurance policies behind a commercial truck compare to personal auto policy in Georgia?
Yeah, so they're just usually bigger, and usually, if I ever get a client A comes in and they say they got hit by, a mom in a Honda, and client B comes in and says they got hit by a large tractor trailer, I can almost guarantee, 99% of the time that client B is going to have more insurance available to them. And again, that's because tractor trailer companies and drivers are required to maintain a minimum amount, usually $750,000. In some instances, it's actually more. Sometimes they're required to carry as much as $5 million. And oftentimes these companies are large. And so even they go above and beyond the minimum requirements for insurance because they want to protect themselves from these car wrecks. And so they'll maintain more. So yeah, by and large, the heavy truck cases are going to have more value, unfortunately, just because that they have more insurance.
Wow. So a victim is hearing SA referenced repeatedly and asking what it actually means. What federal regulations govern trucking companies that do not apply to ordinary Georgia drivers?
Yeah, that acronym FMCSA, that is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act, which is the act that puts in place the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. I'll tell a quick story. When I was a young lawyer and I was working for another attorney and I had my first tractor trailer case, I said, well, how do I learn, how to handle one of these tractor trailer cases? He said, well, you should learn the federal, the FMCR, the regulations, because if you know the regulations, you know what standards they are held to. And I spent the next week reading every single word of the FMCSR, which is a book that's this tall and this wide and very thick, and learned every single aspect of it. I've probably forgotten more, about it than I learned that day. But, for that reason, that's a really good advantage that we have because they are held to higher standards. And in litigation, you need a qualified attorney who's going to have the knowledge base to hold them to those standards, to know what those standards are. And if they haven't met them, that needs to be at the forefront of your case.
Mm-hmm. So that's what the SA stands for. What federal regulations govern trucking companies that I guess wouldn't apply to a regular driver here in Georgia?
Sure. So a regular driver in Georgia, they have to obey the rules of the road, but otherwise they're not limited in how long they drive, and they don't have requirements as to drug testing. For a tractor trailer driver, there's what's one major factor of the regulations are the hours of service, which are the maximum amount of time they can be on the road. And, there's maximums in terms of per day. There's maximum in terms of, over the course of 7 and 10 days, how long they can be on the road. So that's a major thing that, we find often truck drivers, they go over those hours of service because that's the way that they make money, but that's a violation of the federal regulations. Other things that, really I've seen a lot of these cases is they are required after any wreck where there is an injury or a disabled vehicle after the wreck, they are required to undergo drug and alcohol testing. I believe the alcohol testing is within 8 hours and the drug testing is within 24 hours. I found in my career that most of the time, these truck companies do not comply with that regulation. And I think that's probably because they don't want to know the answer to what those drug and alcohol tests would have revealed otherwise. But when they don't comply with that, that's something that can bolster the case and make it a higher, likelihood of collecting things like punitive damages or, just showing that this is a irresponsible company, an irresponsible driver who a jury shouldn't feel bad for when they're deciding what amount of damages to award.
Mm-hmm. Once the framework is clear, the next question is what evidence actually proves the case and how fast it disappears in Savannah. Truck case evidence has a clock. Without a preservation letter in the first 30 days, the most important records are legally overwritten and the case is built on what's left. A victim is hearing about a 30-day evidence window and is trying to understand why it's so short. Why does evidence disappear so fast in Georgia truck accident cases? And what is the role of a Savannah area spoliation letter?
Yeah, it's incredibly crucial, much more than just your average car case, to hire an attorney as quickly as possible because there's these regulations that truck drivers are required to follow. There's usually a trail of records to show whether they complied or didn't comply. Mm-hmm. And some of those records are going to be around for a long time, but some of the records, might be destroyed very quickly. And if you have an experienced attorney, they should be sending what's called a preservation letter to tell the companies do not spoliate, or in other words, don't destroy these records. If you destroy the records, then there's going to be consequences to it once we file a lawsuit. And so things like video might record over it several days or weeks. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't sent a preservation letter, then they might destroy that evidence, not knowing that there's some type of claim. At least they'll claim that they didn't realize there was a claim. So it's very more important than any other type of wreck case and commercial motor vehicle cases to send a preservation letter as quickly as possible. I also mentioned the hours of service. They actually have driver's logs that show how long they're driving and how long they're on the road. And these are things that they will routinely destroy unless there's a preservation letter requesting them to preserve that evidence.
That's very interesting. You wouldn't really think about that preservation letter. It's not something that I certainly have thought about at all. So it's great that we talked about that. A victim has heard about the truck's black box and is asking what it actually records. What is a black box on a truck and why does it actually tell investigators at a Savannah crash scene?
Yeah, those are super important. And in today's day and age, just about every vehicle on the road will have that, both the actual smaller cars, but also heavy trucks. If they're over a certain age, they might not have them, but generally these days they all do. But the importance of that, it shows so much data. It shows you everything from the speed before impact, whether they tried to brake, whether they were wearing a seatbelt, whether the air conditioning was on, whether the radio was on, all these different things you can decide. And so if a truck driver says, well, I was going, 55 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour zone, but the black box data says they were going 75 miles per hour, well, that's a significant and important piece of evidence in proving your case and showing that maybe they're either misremembering or not being completely honest about what they were doing that day.
That's great. With the black box, that it can tell all of that data. The black box, I'm assuming, is correct 100% of the time, or?
Well, so they're really complicated sometimes. And, especially with like hydroplaning cases, right? The data is generally correct, but how you interpret the data can sometimes be difficult. And so there are experts who I have to rely on in certain cases to be able to understand the data. It's not as simple as, just printing it off and saying, oh, well, this was happening in this way. Sometimes an expert needs to tell you what it means when one wheel is spinning, but the other wheel is not. And again, typically that would be in a hydroplane sort of situation.
That makes sense. A victim is being told the driver was running over hours and wants to know how that gets proved. How does a driver logbooks and hours of service records become evidence in a Georgia truck case?
Yeah, those are super important. They used to only do the handwritten driver's logs, and there's basically a sheet of paper where they would use a pencil to track when they were driving and when they weren't driving. Now, by and large, there's what you call electronic driver's logs, which record the actual time without, someone who could maybe fudge the records a little bit, that'll actually show, when they're on the road, when they're driving, when they're in their cab, all these different points of data. It's incredibly important because, oftentimes a jury wants to know, why did this happen? And sometimes it's just as simply as the driver was fatigued. He was tired. He'd been on the road for 20 hours that day. Anybody would be tired under those circumstances, but they have, again, requirements of how long they can drive. And if they're going over those hours, it's a really strong case in terms of showing that they were fatigued and that they were, potentially on the hook for punitive damages. But even if they're under the hours of service, it's still important data because you could still show a jury, listen, they might have been 5 minutes less than the federal regulations required, but they clearly were feeling tired. It was towards the end of the day. They were feeling fatigued. They should have pulled over, stopped driving, but they chose not to, chose to try to push on, and it caused this catastrophic injury.
Yeah, those logbooks sound super important. A victim is asking what the firm does in the first 30 days. What does the early investigation of a Savannah truck accident actually involve? And what does the Georgia State Patrol bring to the scene?
Yeah, so the first and foremost thing is getting that preservation letter out that we talked about earlier. You want to get that out to the trucking company, to the insurance company, to the driver, everybody who possibly has control of any of the records. You're also at times going to want to send preservation letters out to third parties. Maybe you got in a wreck outside of a gas station that has a camera that caught the whole thing. So if the driver tries to say it happened one way, maybe they say they had the green light, there might be a camera that shows exactly how it happened. So you want to send out preservation letters to third party businesses and other potential witnesses. The second step, and the second thing you really want to be doing in your early first 30 days investigation, is talking to every possible witness. Typically, the Georgia State Patrol, if they've done a good job in their investigation, will list the witnesses who either saw the wreck occur or came, there for the aftermath and maybe assisted with someone who had an injury. And so it's really important to talk to those witnesses, talk to the police, collect body cam footage and dash cam footage from the police, and really just piece everything together. And then once you have the preservation letter sent out, you've got some of this evidence, you've talked to the witnesses, you've got that black box data that we mentioned earlier. Then the third, the sort of the last thing in that early portions of the investigation is you want to get a really good expert involved to help you piece all of that together, to reconstruct what happened at the scene, what the black box data shows, what the camera footage shows, so that you understand your case early on, so you know where to go and how to pursue it further.
Definitely. One thing that we didn't mention in this portion, but we've talked about in past episodes, was just the scene investigation. I know that's something that happens more immediately, right at the very beginning of that time period. But I would assume that the scene investigation in a case like this is equally as important as other cases that we've discussed in other episodes. Is that correct?
Yeah, as equal or maybe more important, just because, again, typically you're just going to have larger, more serious injuries, and you're going to have higher insurance limits. And so these are definitely ones that you want to go out to the scene, understand the feel of the scene, how it could have happened. As an attorney, get your head around how things went down.
Mm-hmm. So a victim is hearing about 3 to 5 experts on their case and wants to understand why and what Georgia's evidence rules mean for them. Why do truck accident cases so often involve expert witnesses, and how does Georgia's Daubert standard under O.C.G.A. 24-77702 affect qualification?
Great questions. So truck cases typically require more experts than just your average car wreck case, because we mentioned those standards earlier, right?
Right.
You can read what the standards say, but sometimes it requires an expert, someone who's an expert in the industry, who is either a truck safety person, truck driver, or crewman, and say, here's how these things actually apply in these particular circumstances. And so you want to get that type of expert for some truck accident cases. We also mentioned reconstructing the scene and having an accident reconstructionist. And, again, because of the unfortunate nature of the catastrophic injuries you usually see in a truck wreck case, you're going to need experts to go through what this is going to look like over the course of time for this person. If, unfortunately, it's someone who's paraplegic, you're probably going to want to have a life care planner expert come in who can explain the costs of retrofitting your house, the costs of medical expenses moving forward. And you also need an economist expert, because all of those costs need to be put together and discounted back to present day value. And so an economist would be really important. So, you can have 5, 6, 7 experts in a tractor trailer case, and they do get very expensive. Trust me on that. So in the evidence code that you mentioned a second ago, that's something that the court plays as a gatekeeper to only let qualified, reliable experts testify at trial. So if you don't have the credentials and you don't have if you're not reliably applying the facts of the case, a court can actually exclude your expert from testifying. And the same is true for the other side, though. If the other side has someone who's unqualified or saying things that just really are not rationally based in reason, then a court can say the jury doesn't get to hear that expert because it's not reliable enough for us to allow a jury to consider that evidence.
Okay. Evidence builds the case. Next is what the trucking company does to fight back, including how Savannah's unique freight infrastructure shapes the defense playbook. Trucking companies have insurance, in-house counsel, and a playbook. Their first move is always almost the same. And the Port of Savannah and I-95, I-16 corridor add a defense angle most jurisdictions never see. A victim is wondering why the carrier seems prepared from day one. How does a trucking company sometimes try to limit its own exposure after a crash in Chatham County?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So even if you're prudent and you call an attorney the day after a wreck, I can almost guarantee you in any serious tractor trailer accident, the attorney for the defense has already been out to the scene. There are attorneys who are on retainer with tractor trailer companies and insurance companies in Savannah who will get a call at 12:30 a.m. If there's a tractor trailer event that's an hour away, they'll send the attorney out there. And so before the plaintiff's attorney ever even hears about a case or knows that there's a claim or that the client, has had a serious injury, they're already investigating the scene. They're already talking to their witnesses and coaching them what to say and how to what to say to police and whether or not to get that alcohol and drug test. And so it is you're at a bit of a disadvantage as a plaintiff early on in the case, but if you hire the right attorney, you can mitigate that disadvantage greatly, and you can actually turn it on its head and make it an advantage for your case. For if you have a seasoned, good trial attorney.
Yeah, find a good attorney.
Yeah.
A victim is asking whether the driver's prior record matters. What role does the truck driver's qualification and history play in a Savannah case? And how does Georgia's negligent hiring law work?
It's super important, right? For a lot of reasons. The most important is the one you just mentioned. Truck companies and brokers, and even sometimes insurance companies, have responsibilities to not be negligent when they're hiring someone. They have obligations to do background checks and to see if this particular driver has a pattern of reckless or dangerous driving. And if they don't do that and they put somebody who is reckless or dangerous on the road under, their placard, then they can be held responsible for, negligent hiring, negligent retention. Even negligent retention just means maybe you've come to understand that they are reckless or dangerous after you hired them. You have an obligation to no longer employ that person, or at least not to put them on the road where they can seriously injure or kill people. The other reason it's really important to be able to prove a pattern of dangerous driving in the past is that can potentially, in some circumstances, entitle you to punitive damages, which, again, punitive damages are when someone is acting so carelessly that they consciously are indifferent to the consequences. That's the standard in Georgia. If you're able to prove that, then you can actually, in addition to the damages for your injuries and your pain and suffering, you can collect damages that are intended to punish and deter the tractor trailer companies to try to prevent this from happening in the future.
Are the tractor trailer companies required to do any sort of medical examinations or certifications with new hires?
Yeah, well, not necessarily always with new hires. They are required to confirm that they have had their medical certification. I think the requirements are every 24 months, a driver has to have a medical certification. Some drivers have to do it every 12 months, depending on if they have any sort of conditions that might warrant them to show up more routinely, or if they have eyesight issues. But yes, every tractor trailer driver is required under the regulations to undergo a medical certification every 2 years.
I was just curious because I am assuming that some of these accidents happen due to medical emergency on the driver's behalf. So I was just wondering.
Yeah.
So a victim is asking how cargo loading factors into Savannah area liability, especially with the freight running into the port. How can a cargo problem or an overload trailer cause a serious crash on I-95 or I-16 outside of Savannah?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're not just required under the regulations to do things while you're driving, but before you're driving, when you're packing a particular container. One thing you mentioned is overloading. When you're overloaded and it's too heavy, it affects how quickly you can stop. So maybe you're following, a safe distance behind someone for regular weights and conditions. But if someone slams on the brake in front of you and you have an overloaded or too heavy trailer, then it might prevent you from being able to stop, even if you were at a safe distance, and cause the crash. Another way that container, packing can lead to wrecks is if you don't pack it in a particular way that makes it uneven. That can lead to things like the trailer flipping over or fishtailing, or any number of other safety hazards. And so it's really important to investigate that portion of the claim. By the way, that's another potential defendant we didn't discuss earlier. Sometimes it's the driver himself who packs the trailer, but sometimes it comes pre-packed, the container, which means whoever packed the container could be held liable if that's what led to ultimately you getting seriously injured or killed.
Well, that's something that you wouldn't even really think of, when something like this happens, is what was in the trailer, how it was packed, how heavy it was, etc.
Yeah.
A victim is being told the truck had pre-crash mechanical problems. What is negligent maintenance and how does it lead to truck accidents in the Savannah area?
Yeah, so part of those regulations we mentioned, another thing that's really important is these drivers are required to perform what's called pre-trip and post-trip maintenance inspections. And there's a whole checklist of things that they're supposed to do every single time. They're supposed to check the tread depth of the tires and whether the tires are filled with enough air. And if there's any sort of mechanical defects, if their lights are working at night, all these sorts of things, they're supposed to be checking before they get on the road every single time. If they stop for gas, they need to be doing another pre-trip inspection before they hit the road again. And so rarely do they actually do that. They're supposed to fill out a form that says everything they did. But if they don't do that, then oftentimes things will get missed. There will be mechanical defects. And even if you're driving, prudently at a safe speed and a safe distance, but you didn't check the brakes or you didn't check the tread depth, you might have caused a wreck as a truck driver because you didn't do one of those particular things that led to the wreck. And you can also hold them liable for not doing that.
Oh, wow. And what happens, I guess, like if something, you had to get maintenance performed on the truck, and the maintenance wasn't performed properly, or the maintenance wasn't, done the right way, I guess, like who is liable in that case?
Great question. Sometimes the driver and the company can be held liable, but that's another potential defendant that you want to be looking into, depending on what type of case it is the service company. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a Freightliner dealership, or maybe it's a mom and pop shop that, is performing the maintenance. But yeah, if you are negligently maintaining the vehicle, whether you're the driver or you're the company the driver brought the vehicle to, you can be held liable if you don't act prudently or you don't catch a defect. Or I've had them where they forgot to put the bolts on the wheel and a wheel went through a poor woman's front door just because they forgot to put the lug nuts on the wheel to secure it. And so that was a particular instance where it wasn't the driver's fault. In that particular instance, it was the company who put the tire on who we were able to bring a case against.
Interesting. A victim is wondering whether driver fatigue can be proved. How does the driver fatigue actually factor into a Georgia truck accident claim?
Yeah, so sometimes it's really easy to understand. If they go over the hours of service federal regulations, then, there's a pretty good inference that they were fatigued. Sometimes it's a little more difficult, though. Mm-hmm. And one thing I think that a really experienced trial attorney can do is explain to the jury, what factors would actually suggest that someone is fatigued and should have pulled over on the side of the road instead of putting the motoring public at danger. And so, things like, did they have the AC on? Did they just pick up a cup of coffee? Maybe they got coffee because they were getting tired. So you could check their receipts from their mm-hmm. credit cards, but also, even if they're under the hours of service, have they been driving a lot lately? Is there things going on in their personal lives that are meaning they're maybe not getting sleep? Did they drink alcohol the night before? That can make you more fatigued. So there's a number of things that you can investigate that can help prove that a driver is fatigued in a tractor trailer collision case.
Liability is one half of the case. Damages is the other half, and where Georgia's statutory framework really diverges from the rest of the country. Once liability is established, the conversation shifts to value. Truck cases carry damages numbers that look nothing like car cases, and Georgia's punitive damages framework adds a layer most states do not have. A victim is trying to understand how the firm arrives at a settlement demand number. How is the value of a Savannah truck accident case calculated under Georgia damages law?
Yeah, it's a really hard question because every case is different, and there are factors, and I tell clients this all the time, there are factors that affect the value of your case that have really sometimes nothing to do with the value of your hurt or your pain or the loss mm-hmm. of your loved one. Sometimes it's as simple as what county are we in? If the case is filed in Savannah or in Chatham County, usually we have very favorable jurors who are intelligent and can understand the facts. And I, in my experience, have a lot of empathy. Right. Sometimes you might be in a venue that, people are just a little bit more tough to award you a large sum of damages. And so those are factors that go into these things, but a lot of it is just experience, trying cases, understanding that you can always lose a case. There's mm-hmm. no such thing as a slam dunk. And so you have to factor in the risk. You have to factor in, like you mentioned, punitive damage factors. If there's a lot of evidence that shows that the company and the driver were violating federal standards, well, that's a case that might push up the amount of damages. And that sometimes has nothing to do with how badly hurt you are. It has everything to do with punitive damages and whether a jury's not going to like the other side based on their conduct.
Yeah. A victim is staring at Memorial Health bills and wants to understand the economic damages math. What are economic damages in a catastrophic Savannah trucking case, and how is the future care valued?
Yeah, so and it's a scary place to be
Yeah.
because you're living a healthy life and maybe you're able to afford your mortgage and all these things, and all of a sudden you have tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, and sometimes even millions of dollars of medical bills. Especially if it's a bad burn case from a tractor trailer case, oftentimes fires can happen. In those instances, oftentimes you might have to go to the Augusta Burn Center. Your bills can get really, really high. But even just going to Memorial Health here in Savannah, typically you're going to run in the tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. And so economic damages are those types of damages, things like your medical bills, things like if you weren't able to work for several months, your lost wages, those are part of the economic damages. Then we have what's called the non-economic damages. That's what is the value of the pain, the suffering, the anguish? What's the value in some circumstances of somebody's life if it's been taken from them in a tractor trailer collision? And so you have to piece together both of those economic and non-economic damages to really arrive at what a reasonable value for the case would be.
And there's a professional that kind of figures out what the future care is valued at?
In some instances, not always, but like we mentioned earlier, sometimes you get what's called a life care planner, and usually in tandem with an economist.
Okay.
And these are experts who could put together what is this going to cost for me if it's a prosthetic case, for me replacing the prosthetic. If you have like a spinal cord stimulator that's implanted in you, replacing the battery costs money every 5, 10, however many years it is. And so having a qualified life care planner expert who can actually put all that together and understand what your medical needs are going to be into the future and what those costs associated with that are going to be really helps you paint the picture to a jury as to what your damages are and what they're going to be over the course of the rest of your life.
And how does that work if somebody, has some sort of injury, life-changing injury, and that injury changes after we've already met in court?
So if you've already settled the case or you've already tried your case and those injuries change, unfortunately, there's nothing that you can really do. You only get one shot at a settlement. You only get one shot at trial. That's why we really, before I'm ever encouraging most of my clients to settle a case, I want to know the full picture.
Okay.
I don't want there to be any question as to that there might be additional medical needs in the future, but I want to know what are those medical needs going to be and have an expert there to help us consult as to what are those going to be, because we don't want to leave any dime on the table, because you might get what seems like a favorable recovery today, but if you then have to have 3 more surgeries in the future that you didn't account for, you might be in the negative. And that's not where we want to be.
Sounds like really phoning those experts is imperative in those really life-changing cases.
Yeah.
A victim is asking when the case crosses from compensatory into punitive territory under Georgia law. When can a Savannah family pursue punitive damages against a trucking company in Georgia under O.C.G.A. 5112.5.1, including the DUI exception to the $250K cap?
Right. And that's a good point. So typically punitive damages are capped, as you mentioned, at only $250,000. And to even get to that, to get to a jury to award punitive damages, you have to show that at the very least they were consciously indifferent to the consequences, meaning they took an action that they didn't necessarily know would result in an injury, but they knew that there was a high likelihood that it would lead to something like that. You can prove that by patterns and practices, by past times of speeding, and maybe they're a habitual drunk driver. And, maybe the company knew that they had a history of drunk driving, but still put that dangerous person on the road. That's when you're going to have, a good case for punitive damages. If you're just basing on the patterns and practices sort of thing, you are capped at a $250,000 punitive damages award. However, if you can prove either what's called specific intent, or more applicable to truck cases, that you were a drunk driver and got a DUI, then that cap does not apply. And that means you could be entitled to any level of punitive damages. There are punitive damages awards in Georgia that are in the tens of millions of dollars. And so depending on the circumstances of your case and how bad the conduct was of the company and the driver, you can get above the $250,000 cap.
Wow. So a victim's family is trying to understand who has standing to bring a wrongful death claim in Georgia. What happens when a Savannah truck accident results in a fatality? Who can file the wrongful death claim under O.C.G.A. 5142?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends on the circumstances. It can be different in every case. If you were married, then your spouse is the person who is able to bring that. If you didn't have a spouse, then typically it's going to be your kid or your children. So if you have 3 or 4 children, those 3 or 4 children, any one of whom can bring a wrongful death claim, or they can all be named plaintiffs. If you don't have a spouse and don't have children, typically it goes to your parents, the claim for wrongful death. And if you don't have parents, it would go to a sibling, and so on and on. There's a whole, hierarchy of who would be able to bring those claims under certain circumstances. But typically, it's going to be your wife, your husband, your kids, or your parents.
Mm-hmm. A victim is hearing about 3 different courthouses and wants to know what venue actually means for their case. How does the choice between Chatham County State Court, Chatham County Superior Court, and Federal Court in Savannah affect a truck accident case?
It affects it greatly. And that's one of the things I mentioned earlier. That's a factor that really has, in many ways, nothing to do with the value of your harm, but it has so much to do with the value of your case. And, there's a lot of thought that goes into state versus superior. Sometimes we might like a particular judge in either state or superior court that we might feel is, more favorable or unfavorable. And there might be decisions why. Sometimes we might file in one of those particular courts, state versus superior, if we feel like this is a case that we want to get to a trial quicker. Typically, superior court is going to be a little bit quicker than our state courts these days. And to our state court judges, we know you're backlogged. We're not blaming you for that. But it sometimes does take a little bit longer to get on a jury trial calendar. And then the decision between those state courts or federal court has huge implications. When you file in either state or superior court in a state court, your jury will be exclusively from Chatham County. If you file in federal court, it will pull from a much broader, all of the surrounding counties. So not just Chatham, but I think it's Bryan and Effingham and maybe Glenn County. There's several counties that are pooled where the juries would be pulled from that mean, maybe a little bit less about what your jury makeup's going to look like. And so having a favorable jury is obviously a very important factor. Yeah. And that's what makes venue an incredibly important thing that you need to be considering.
Absolutely. Well, that covers what makes the case worth what it is worth in Savannah. Last beat is one piece of advice for the listener and how to reach Conn Law Firm. Before we close, give the person listening right now one piece of advice that they can act on today.
If you're in a tractor trailer wreck today, the most important thing is you need to hire an experienced attorney as soon as possible. I don't say that about every type of case because some cases do allow for you to kind of go through maybe a grieving process or to try to start to heal before you start considering these options. But for the reasons I mentioned today, they're going to have their attorneys on the scene that night or that morning or whenever the wreck happened. They're already going to be preparing their defense. They're already going to be deciding what documents they want to destroy so that you don't have access to them. And if you don't hire an attorney quickly to preserve that evidence and to advocate for your interests, sometimes you can lose the evidence you need to be successful in your case. And even though you've gone through a tragedy, there might not be compensation available to you if you don't act quickly enough.
Yep. Get an experienced, awesome attorney and get one fast.
Yeah.
If you or
Yeah.
your family member was hurt in a commercial truck crash in Savannah or anywhere across Georgia, call Conn Law Firm at 912-373-82 or visit andyconn.attorney to talk to Andy Conn directly. The consultation is free. Thanks for listening to Savannah Car and Truck Accident Law with Andy Conn. We will see you on the next episode.